Yes.
Question number one. What does this pandemic reveal about values in society?
I think generally speaking, it reveals that people have very different values and very different priorities. Because I think in a lot of the ways that we've seen both large scale like governments react to the pandemic, but also just normal day-to-day people, I think we could see that there's different value systems that are at play. And I think a lot of that like does stem from ethics. And I think specifically in my eyes, not to get like super ethical, but
Hmm.
um, I feel like there's kind of this head-to-head conflict going on between Rawlsian and utilitarian like ethical standpoints, and I don't know how familiar you are with that and slash how far you want me to go into that. But like super, I guess, short and concise, like the first is more about like what does the person who's quote unquote worst off in society need in order to survive and in order to make it, whereas the second one judges people on their individual worth. So a lot of it stems from like their status quo and what they have available to them at that moment. So I feel like a lot of public health is about like Rawlsian ethics, where it focuses on the people who are marginalized and vulnerable, whereas I think a lot of like politics and economic, I guess, actions that have been taken so far are more utilitarian in terms of like how useful people are to society. And I'm like thinking about like the lieutenant governor of Texas who was suggesting that like people who are older should in a way like sacrifice themselves because they aren't as useful to society as someone who's younger and has more years ahead of them would be. So yeah,
Wow.
just I just feel like there's this big divide between what people value, and I don't think it's been more. I think a lot of us knew that before this, but I think it's more apparent than ever before, just how far those differences go.
Got it. Thank you. Um, Question number two. What has the pandemic revealed to your own values?
One of my majors is public health, and I think one of the biggest things I I think a part of it is just how public health oriented I am, and a lot of it I think goes back to this idea of like, to me, this like service of marginalized communities and vulnerable communities is so important because at the end of the day, like even the data right now, the very little data we have about COVID-19 shows that people who are getting the short stick of this, or the short end of the stick with the pandemic, are those who don't have access to healthcare, who don't have a home, who don't have a steady like source of income, who have some sort of linguistic barriers, like people who just don't have the privileges that so many of us have been granted for really no other reason than just luck. And so I feel like, to me, I don't know, this is my opinion, but I just feel like the responses and interventions that are being posed shouldn't be like, they're not all created equal in a way, because people like the people they're targeting aren't created equal. And so I feel like I've seen less of that in a lot of the actions that have been taken. I feel like governments are expecting that if you just do this one thing, like it's going to help everyone, without realizing just how stratified society is and how different and diverse the needs of people within that society are.
Great. And then the last question is 50 years from now, what would you want people to remember about these times?
I feel like this is like a circular answer, but I want them to remember these times. I don't know how much you've read about like or heard about the 1918 like pandemic that happened, but there's a ton of parallels between that like flu pandemic and COVID-19. And it's kind of like, I'm in a race class and gender class
Uh-huh.
for public health, and we were talking about just how much of the issues that persisted in society at that time like have continued in the way that, and like especially in the ways that people have chose to react to this. And like we've seen so much xenophobia, we've seen so much prejudice, we've seen so much, I think, individualism and selfishness, and so much of that is exactly paralleled by what happened in the 1918 pandemic. So I feel like a part of me hopes that in 50 years like we remember like um what this time was and what it did, or how it impacted everyone regardless of any other confounding factors. And I hope we use that, or we're able to use that as a way to address these issues that are in society and like these fissures that exist right now, and use that as a way to help those who need it the most.